when you grow, you change. And when you change, you lose things. And when you lose things, you grieve. This is part of life. When we grow, we're going to experience pain. And getting the ratio right between how much growth and how much healing, I think, is a really good question to put out there.
Hi, I'm Nathan Toops, and this is the Functionally Imperative Podcast. In this episode, I'm speaking with Robert Kelley about a new philosophical system called Metamodernism. We talk about all kinds of stuff in this episode, everything from societal challenges, personal growth, and how we can engage in an increasingly polarized world. Anyway, here's our conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Hey, Robert.
Hey, Nate.
How's it going?
Great. Thanks for having me on here.
Yeah, it's been really neat. You and I have had a couple of conversations at this point, and I thought this would be really cool to share on the podcast just because every time I've had a conversation with you, I felt so energized afterwards. And I feel very like inspired to think about big thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, that's it's funny you say that because uh, I guess I always wonder why everyone else isn't thinking about big thoughts all the time. It's so yeah, I think from the very beginning when we first chatted, there was this kind of like, hey, we're I don't know, concerned about some of the same issues and intrigued by some of the similar approaches. Um, and I mean, I'm really looking forward to see where this conversation here goes.
Yeah. Well, I guess we can give a little bit of a backstory. I was doing some research on the internet. I was looking up there's a lot of like sociology and psychology of different communities in the tech world. I've been doing work in blockchain, and when I was doing a lot of research about sort of the communities and ecosystem, you came up in some podcasts and interviews that I had found. I'd reached out to you randomly, and we just started chatting. And one of the first things that struck me was this concept of metamodernism. And I thought it since it was such an inspiring thing for me. I think you introduced this book called The Listening Society,
Yeah.
um, and the and I wanted to see if you could explain a little bit of metamodernism to our audience.
Sure. So metamodernism is this idea that the world we're in right now is basically a battle between, and I'm simplifying, right? I'm really simplifying, but
I love it.
a battle between modernism, which you can kind of define as starting with like the Enlightenment, which is really based around, um, rationality, you know, sort of the Cartesian kind of approach to things. It's a building kind of era of the world where we build these sort of grand theories and these grand institutions, democracy, um, capitalism, but communism as well, and these great nation states, concepts like human rights and these kinds of things. And that's probably still the sort of dominant sort of era that we live in. But what's been challenging it is something called postmodernism. And my understanding of postmodernism is you can kind of track its beginning to the invention of the photograph, where before, with modernism, you had a truth. You had a single truth. And then, as the photograph made clear to people, if I take a picture of something from my perspective and you take the picture from your perspective, we can see very different things. We can see the same thing very differently. And not only that, but we can reproduce this photograph. I am borrowing this from somebody who I can't remember who I'm borrowing it from, so just to make that clear. And so what winds up happening is this idea, this idea of modernism being this sort of absolute truth, starts getting chipped away at over the course of the 20th century. And you have movements like, social justice movements. You have, ideas of kind of giving people who have been underrepresented a say in how things are going. And people start losing faith in some of these big ideas that we had in the past, in the nation state, in, some of the big systems that we've come to rely on. And so this is postmodernism. And postmodernism is defined by deconstruction. So modernism, you have a construction. Postmodernism, you have a deconstruction. And then you get to about the turn of the century where, roughly our generation gets online and starts looking. And there are some people out there, this sort of emerging group of people who look at the world and say, postmodernists, you've got a real good point. There is no absolute truth. And all of these systems are fundamentally flawed to their core. Like, really, the critique is spot on. But modernists, you got a point too, which is we got to build something. Like, we still have to construct things together as a society. And, when I look out at the, being the, sort of speaking on behalf of all of these metamodernists, I'd call us, is there is no absolute truth, but some things are truer than others. And, we can see that, actually, it seems like 99.9% of people tend to believe this way of doing things is better. Not to exclude the very small minority, but maybe there is some wisdom in the masses. Maybe we can see that there are some ways of doing things that are better. So hierarchies do exist. They might be ephemeral. They might be very limited in their context, but we can see that some things are better than others, and we can try to build again, trying to avoid the same mistakes that modernism made, knowing full well that we will always make mistakes ourselves. So the way that metamodernism is sometimes described is as like an oscillation between these two seemingly divergent or opposing viewpoints. And so you have these terms that people use like sincere irony, or you have informed naivete. And not everyone says that that's exactly what metamodernism is, but I believe that that's something, being comfortable with contradictions, and being aware that just because someone says something and does another doesn't make them like a totally inexcusable hypocrite. It just makes them human, actually. And so, I like to think that metamodernism at its best is this emerging way of looking at the world that's actually what we need in our world right now, given the challenges we're looking at.
Yeah, I love that. I think one of the things that resonated with me is that we were talking, and I had never heard of metamodernism, and it seems like we were sort of riffing on these ideas that it seems to be that they're emerging um, in this sort of like, any of us who have maybe are hopeless optimists, and we acknowledge that the tools that were given in postmodernism are useful, but I think this is one of the things I loved about the listening society, is that while I think postmodernism is fantastic with critique. We've said the same thing
Yep.
about communism too, right? I think communism is actually a fantastic critique framework, but it's a really terrible roadmap
Yeah.
for actually like building stuff. I mean, we've had time and time again really failed experiments using this, where I think that oscillation of a building phase and a critique phase, or a building phase and a tear down phase, are useful because both sides have assumptions that are wrong, right? We think this is how we should build the future, and we made a mistake. Like one of our, core tenets or something was off. One of the things I think you actually have in your Substack, I was kind of scouring through this a bit. You frame really well, and I think the book does too, that there's these like phases, right, in our lives. Like, you're a baby, you're a child, you're an
Yep.
adolescent, young adult, mature adult, crisis adult, wise adult. Like, there's all these phases here.
Yeah.
And one of the things I loved, you look at this and you go, oh, okay, well, there's this like pecking order at first, right? And it's actually really easy to punch down to the previous phase and be like, oh, when I was an adolescent, that was so embarrassing. Like now I'm
Exactly.
an adult. Um, I would love for you to you elaborate a bit this on your in the Substack, but I think that recognizing these phases and instead of punching down, what's another relationship that you can have with sort of this movement that we all naturally go through?
Yeah. So I mean, at a personal level, so at sort of an individual level, you might say, um, I think the way that I've come around to seeing it is that we are, and once again, this is like I borrowed from a million people, so I'm not
Of
claiming this
course,
as an
of
original
course.
idea. Um, but we have nested inside of ourselves these different sort of layers of growth. Um, and when we sort of unlock a new one, they're like wisdom teeth, like all of us have the capacity for them. And, usually through some like life experience and time, we begin to unlock new ones, but we don't lose the old ones. So inside of all of us is an inner child. And there's a theorist out there by the name of Robert Keegan, um, I think a adult development psychologist from Harvard, who defines childhood as being you are your wants and your needs. And so what this means is we grow up, we become adults, but we still have wants and needs. And what we often do, let's say in adolescence, is we realize that, we, um, well, you know, we might need to suppress our wants and needs or our urges in order to get the thing that we want in that moment. And so that suppression becomes a tool that we use throughout our adult lives. And we sort of lose touch with what that inner child wants. Um, and a lot of, I think a lot of us have done that. Like that's what growing up is often. Like shut your mouth, keep your feelings to yourself if you don't want to be punished. And then you get older and you've got this wounded inner child inside of you who is still crying in there, is still crying out for what they want. And as we sort of get older and get sort of begin unlocking this kind of wise adult stage, we see ourselves less as one monolithic like ego and more as a manager of several nested personalities inside of ourselves. Um, and I think that this is something that um, it's hard to like get an adolescent to not negate the child inside of them if the child is causing them some kind of distress. But as you grow older, it's easier to go through that process of forgiving the child and forgiving the adolescent for having suppressed the child. Um, and I think that this is like not everyone's path to growing up and being wise or enlightened or whatever looks the same. But I do think that there are some like there is like a very general roadmap of what that looks like. And I don't think you see people become enlightened and also learn to suppress their
Right.
inner personalities.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I think that one of the interesting things that the metamodernism framework through listening society brought up as well is that there's these parallels between sort of individual development and societal
Yep.
development, right? So we've been talking about individual development, but societal development seems to, at least, the argument that they're making goes through these phases as well. And I think this is where it gets a little sticky because we're so close to some of them. Um, but I think it's also useful, right? It's useful in the sense that let's start with this framework. We can amend it over time. Of course, you get permission with this in metamodernism. It's not that there's these absolutes. It's really sort of an observational pendulum
Yep.
swing framework that I appreciate. And I think, again, you know, starting from like a societal spiritual and rationality sort of development, you can kind of, the framework being, okay, well, we start as these animals, then we get animistic, sort of introduce spirituality. And, humans have been doing this for a long time. I think the further we go back and see, art and pottery and cave paintings and stuff, you can see the sparks of this for, very ancient humans. Then we sort of like, I guess the next phase is sort of nations and empires and, more formal gods. And then we get into monotheism and then age of rationality. And then I guess post rationality, where we kind of are. And then I think you outlined and you say like reconciliation, or
Yeah.
this idea that maybe we can, and again, I think in the framework of, I think up until metamodernism, it seemed that a lot of these punched down in the same way that we were talking earlier, where like, oh, well, I'm rational now, science is here. So, religion's completely useless and just a part of our primitive past. Or the post-rational are like, oh, well, look at all the things science got wrong. And so therefore we shouldn't trust it at all. Right. And I think this idea of like, okay, well, metamodernism is like, oh, there's actually a role for all of these pieces, and they're actually like an important part of our development, and that maybe we should acknowledge that each one of these actually built on the other to get where we are today.
Let me give you an example, because I think
Yeah.
this is so interesting. Just maybe a month ago, I was in Iceland, and obviously the second Hansi Freinacht book after the Listening Society is called The Nordic Ideology. But I felt like Iceland really kind of stood out, because if you look at the history of Iceland, it's, obviously a small, and they've been geographically sheltered for a long time, but they can basically remember culturally back when they were animistic. Like,
Wow.
there is still a substantial percentage of Icelanders who believe in elves. And this has been like the butt of jokes for, many people. But I think if you look at it from sort of a psychological perspective, there's something really healthy, because they're keeping that childlike aspect of their culture alive. They went through a period of this sort of what the Hansi Freinacht guys call um, uh, Faustian. This is sort of like the age of empires, and where they fought, and they emerged from that. The Danes imposed Lutheranism on them, and they remember very well what that fighting was like. They became very devout Christians. They came to modernism probably a little bit late, but they were very good at it. And then they sort of entered postmodernism in a pretty healthy place as a society. Really, like, with all of these different aspects all intact and not fighting each other. And so they were able to kind of like do postmodernism without too much like cultural angst. And it feels like it's the kind of society where, yeah, metamodernism is more ascendant, where you can have these conversations with people where they recognize, okay, I might be allergic to that kind of thing, but I'm not going to jump down your throat because you triggered something or other that I, don't really know why it triggers me so much. And I found it, I found it a fascinating place. I'm sure this is actually what makes Iceland kind of a very healthy place, is that whenever I say this to an Icelander, they immediately tell me why I'm wrong and how actually Iceland has all sorts of problems. And I'm like, it's the mark of a healthy society, is that you
Right.
recognize you have problems. Anyway, yeah.
No, that's great. It really got me to thinking too about these purity tests, right? I think that one of the things that we're really struggling with in the United States is, um, have you heard of the horseshoe theory?
Yeah, of
Are
course.
you,
Yeah,
are
yeah,
you
yeah.
familiar? Yes, right.
I mean,
So
they
right, so
use it
like the
here in France too. So
okay, yeah,
yeah,
yeah. So the horseshoe theory, right, is that this idea that two vehemently opposed extremes are actually not the furthest
Yeah.
apart from each other, but actually kind of shape in a horseshoe and ends up oddly looking similar.
Yeah.
And I find this quite concerning because, um, you know, they end up using very similar tactics, and tactics are something that, and maybe this is because my background, I read a tremendous amount of like Noam Chomsky, especially sort of 80s, 90s era Noam Chomsky. So a lot of things are painted in this lens, and he speaks about um, sort of manufactured consent and this idea of what are considered reasonable discourse. And, um, you know, there are folks who think outside of frameworks in which you can't describe how they speak. Again, this gets back to modernism because I think that they frame this quite well as too, which is that there are certain paradigms of thinking upon which you don't fit within, a left or right
Yep.
scheme, or maybe some of your conclusions might sound radically left, but you might sound radically right in some other ways. And yet you might be psychologically consistent. Um, One of the things that have concerned me, and this is actually, I don't know, maybe this is like a post COVID world, maybe this is going back with, um, you know, the pendulum swing of having Trump and then not having Trump and then having Trump again. Um, I feel like a lot of my friends and family members have taken very strong sides and then use these purity tests to decide to check to see if you're like in the know.
Yep.
Um, where do you think that comes from? Like, what do you think is something that we're struggling with in society that's actually like reverting to the mean and causing us to like have these like sort of like really weird litmus tests?
Yeah. Well, I mean, let me just start by saying, like, you talk about that, and I realize, like, I have my own allergies. Like, I'm allergic to Donald Trump, and I'll put it out there. I and when someone is like a big Trump fan, I
Mhm.
do find that it's difficult to like have any kind of meaningful conversation with them. But let me also chalk that up to like, that's my family upbringing. That's my education. That's who I am. Um, I think that one of the things that we've found, and I think that kind of alluded to this in the definition of metamodernism, is that there is a war between right now between modernism and postmodernism, and that war had previously been a war between modernism and traditionalism, where the right, sort of the right wing, was traditionalist. And it was, the God, country, family kind of thing. We're protecting our old way of life. And the left was super modernist. So we're going to, like an extension of the French Revolution. We are going to stamp out these backwards traditional ways of doing things,
Mhm.
and we're going to create a world, without any of this ridiculous superstition and, the old prejudices of the past. And my theory about what's going on right now is that a lot of those old traditionalists have grown. Like they've kind of, we're all like spiritually developing, culturally developing, but they have such an allergy to modernism that when they were ready to pass beyond traditionalism, they looked at modernism and said, nope, we're just going to jump to the next one, which is postmodernism. And right now, the right wing, at least in like the U.S. cultural context, the right wing is extremely postmodernist. You talk about there not being a truth. Like, it's remarkable even for me to see the extent of the lies that are there all the time. Um, but the left wing, the sort of Democrat Party, which is still stuck in modernism, now they're on the defensive, and they are defending these institutions that even a good portion of people on their side have lost faith in those institutions as well. And so I guess where I'm trying to go here is there's a war. There's like an intellectual civil war that's happening. And um, actually, when you get to the point where it's a war, the ideas themselves become less important, and what's sort of more notable is the means that people use to advance these ideas.
This is interesting. I think, and again, I know we're getting very into US politics
Yeah,
here, but I feel like Obama may have been the end of the Democrats' modernist movement, though, because and again, this is where back to the horseshoe theory, it feels like to me that we're in two flavors of postmodernism
that's exactly right.
between
Yeah,
between the two warring parties, because everything has gotten down to identity politics, whichever your flavor
yeah,
is, right? And I know that identity politics in the United States is now turned to like left identity politics. This might be like DEI or transgenderism or these other areas. But the originators of this are actually the Republican Party, right? They're the ones who said, they're the ones who really doubled down on religion, really doubled down on capitalism
yeah,
or, free market stuff. And it feels like, again, the pendulum swing is that postmodernism critique came in and said, so Republicans say, greed is good, which was originally going to be like a commentary on this, and then it was embraced.
yeah, yeah,
There's all these like other pieces, and again, I think in some ways it's been useful in that it's gained power, right? And I don't mean good in that it's gained power, but it's useful, and so the ideology like served its purpose. But it's fundamentally empty, right? And I think there's an emptiness that it feels like both parties are talking past each other, because I'm like, how are you making things better? Like, how are things other than power seeking?
yeah.
Has the average U.S. citizen done better? Have immigrants had an easier time? Have are students more successful? Do people have more hope about the future? And in that case, I think both parties have actually done a terrible job, right?
Terrible. And I think what I wanted to say about being at war is that, like, fighting makes us really ugly. You know, like I think, when you talk about like these sort of litmus tests, but there are obviously like, like flashpoints around the world, conflicts, where it's like, which side are you on? And
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, I find it hard to be on the side of someone who's doing terrible things to other people.
Right. Right.
I, you know,
Right.
like of course, I want people to stop doing terrible things to other people.
Right.
And I'm not trying to draw like moral equivalences. All I'm trying to say is like, when we are fighting, we are not showing the best sides of ourselves. And
Right.
I think, as Emil from one of the two Hansi Freinacht authors said in a podcast just earlier this week, if fighting makes us dumb. Like it really, instead of moving these, and because the issues we're dealing with are now are complex to an unprecedented degree, and we need to
Yeah.
move them far into the frontal cortex and then into like the collective frontal cortex, and instead we're running them back into our reptile brains and trying to see who can dunk on whom on social media,
Right.
how we can own the libs, or embarrass the Trumpists or whatever it is. And yeah, you're right. Like, what is this actually accomplishing? Um, yeah, I, I mean, I think if you'll just allow me to kind of like introduce this other thing I've been thinking
Oh,
about.
please.
Um,
Please.
so I've been living outside the U.S. for 14 years now. And just a little bit about myself. I was born in Colombia, South America, to a Colombian mother and an American father. Um, I was just a few months old when I moved back to the U.S. Basically, grew up outside of Philadelphia. Totally like American cultured and everything. But my experience was, growing up, when we would go visit Colombia, my mom had a sister who was married to an oil executive, and they lived in a penthouse triplex in the nice part of Bogota. And when I would go visit, they had like the coolest video games before we had them. And like, in my mind, like, just kind of, I never saw Colombia as like an inferior place or a less developed place. I was aware that there was way more poverty there, but I also knew that there was more like, you know, access to like the modern diversions than there was in the rural town I grew up in Pennsylvania. And so, um, I guess I never really had like, I love America. Like I really, I, you know, I've like talked to my therapist about what's happening in the US, and she's French. And she's like, well, it's a country. Like, how can you get so bent out of shape about it? What do you expect? And I'm like, you don't understand what it's like to grow up American. We really have this sense that this nation is a nation of ideals. Um, I think what I've come to realize, though, is that what unites the right and the left in America is a sort of national narcissism where, so narcissism, one of the ways you can define it is this idea that you're really great and you're contemptuous of others who don't recognize your greatness.
Wow.
And you put that at a collective level, and it's like, hey, actually, we all kind of do this. And, you know, both the left and the right do the thing where we're like, we're better than this. And then they do the thing where like, we're like a terrible place. And, you know, you see this kind of like inability to accept ourselves as a special country, but just another country. Just like as a human being, we're all special people, but we're just another human being as well.
Right. That's a lot to think about. And I think I haven't been out of the country for 14 years, but I did live out of the country for 3 years. And I will say, I think it's such a healthy thing for your identity to live somewhere that's different than where you grew up, to understand what is like part of you and what's not a part of you. It's almost an out of body experience, at least it was for me. And I think that's a perspective that more insular societies seem to miss. My daughter's actually traveling with my mom, so with her grandmother, to Japan right now.
Amazing.
And but it's a perfect example of another. It's rare, right? A lot of societies there's multilingual, multicultural aspects. You know, many countries you're speaking like maybe a regional language and a national language like in India or China or but in Japan it's like incredibly insular, and I think it's probably even though culturally very different than the United States, it's also very similar in that you can kind of get in this echo chamber that feels very much like sort of like a monoculture, and yet there are folks that break out or come in or cross pollinate, and it's a beautiful thing. But it's interesting that, you know, most Japanese haven't left the country, right? Most Americans haven't left the country. I'm from South Louisiana, and most of my family isn't that interested
Yeah.
in things outside of the United
Yeah.
States, right? Like it's just like there's like a lack of curiosity to it, or a scariness, right? Like they've heard things are different or scary or dangerous, and so
Yeah.
they don't go there. Um, and so yeah, I think it's really interesting. I hadn't thought of it from the narcissism standpoint. Um, and maybe this is one of the reasons why every time there's an election now, the other party has a really hard time accepting that such a large number of the opposing view could have even voted
Yeah.
for that, you know, existential threat, right? Maybe that comes from this sort of collective narcissism of like, oh, well, we're so right. How could you reach this conclusion? How could you, you know, elect a literal Nazi, or how could you have somebody who's, you know, secretly wants to sell us out to the, you know, WEF or something?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So for human beings, like most of us, 99+% of us are not narcissists because we have a kind of like feedback system that you know tells us, hey, what you're doing like is not a good thing. You know, guilt and
Right.
shame, and these things work. They're there for a reason. Like, of course,
Right.
they can be abused and whatever, but they're there for a reason. But on a collective level, we don't really have that. And I think one of the biggest challenges we have facing, humanity is we've never had groups of people this big sort of
Yeah.
becoming collectives. And now we are seeing this happen across, like we're seeing these ideological um, collectives grow across national boundaries. And I think that, you know, without having some kind of feedback loop saying what is our impact on what we're doing, can we feel that even if we don't have to feel the old ideas or the old feelings of shame and guilt? Can we just be aware that our existence is having this sort of impact on other people, on the planet,
Yeah.
and recognize that actually, like, we're never going to come anywhere close to perfect. We're always, whatever I do in a really complicated system like this, there's going to be someone that's going to suffer. And I don't have to go around whipping myself on the back
Right.
because of this, but I can at least acknowledge it and then, be open to criticism, be open to, alternative ways of doing things that might just collectively raise everyone's experience of being just a little bit, which I think is one of the themes from the Listening Society, to go back to that.
Yeah. So you mentioning your was it your you said your uncle, you had like a wealthy uncle that
Yes,
was in
exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Colombia.
yeah.
It makes that separation of like their maybe uh more well-to-do life versus the existence of maybe a lot, people of much more modest means, um, made me think about another Substack post that you had called "Take a Humanity Bath."
Mm,
Actually, really loved this one, and I
thank
think it
you.
was a nod to, was it Saul
Saul Bellow.
Bellow?
Ah, yeah.
Mm.
Oh, one of the best American Nobel Prize winning author from the 20th century. Yeah.
Let's, for the listeners, like, what is a humanity bath and why should we take one?
Yeah. So in Japan, there's this idea of taking a forest bath or a tree bath, which is go out and just be among nature, just like
Mm.
feel, get away from concrete and metal and other people and just feel being in touch with nature. A humanity bath is just get among a lot of people and feel what it's like to be part of this human collective, to not be like by yourself, but really feel like you're part of the collective. And that we all like, you know, we smell and we have bad breath and
Right.
we miss the spot shaving and all of these kind of things. Like we are we're these very unique animals, who each one of us is like, well, I mean, I hesitate to like use such like flowery language, but from an evolutionary perspective, every single one of our brains is like the most sensitive, like sensor, like neuron in. I don't even know if neuron's the right word, but I'm not a scientist. But like we are, every single human is so much more intelligent than any other animal, and
Right.
I think that being like there's just kind of like a, a beauty that you can experience if you can see other people in that way. And I think I was writing this because one thing I think I've noticed since the pandemic, which you brought up earlier, is that with all of the guidance towards social distancing and isolation and that kind of thing, that I noticed that a lot of people don't go to crowded places anymore. We
Right.
don't go, and I find, like, I'm a big music guy, and so for me, like one of the big aspects of my spirituality is like going to a concert, like a rock
Right.
and roll concert or a hip hop concert with just people jammed in, sweaty, singing, dancing. And I think that's something that we need. Like some the Metamodern revival, if it happens, I wanted to include like a lot of dancing and singing and being among our fellow human beings.
Yeah, I that it really struck me when I was reading your blog post on Humanity Bath was a very different experience. So I used to travel with my previous job. We had a big presence in Europe, and I went to Barcelona, I think 3 or 4 times in like 1 year. I went to Poland, I went to Germany, and I always try to just experience the city. That's just a personal pleasure of mine because you just kind of see the rhythm and the vibe of stuff. And what struck me was that none of my coworkers took public transportation in Barcelona. They would just get a taxi from the
Mm,
airport to straight to the hotel. And I was like, you're missing so
yeah,
much. Like, yeah, sure, maybe it's an extra 20 minutes or something on your journey, but you get to like, it's like the best people watching.
yep,
And you get to see all these like little micro dynamic pieces of, you know, oh, how is this immigrant family sort of being side-eyed, or um how do people accommodate the elderly, or what's the norms for getting on and off and it's super crowded. And I loved it. I mean, I feel like my experience of Barcelona would have been so much poorer if I hadn't have had a humanity bath
yeah.
while I was there. Um, and so I was like, just nodding my head to this, going like, of course. Like, and what's funny is because I work remotely. I am a pretty private, sort of. I mean, I might sound like I'm extroverted a bit, but I think it's something that will drain me over time. I'm like not just doing this. I like to do a lot of like quiet, contemplative, things on my own. I have to remind myself. I have to be mindful about exposing, that side of me and like getting out and doing stuff. Um, and so it felt like, even though I don't think you mentioned metamodernism a single time, there seems to be a mythos there, or an ethos, I should say, of like these kind of messy, juxtaposed things. And I think I wrote down in my notes, I said it required you to sort of have an intentional discomfort for deeper fulfillment. And I'd love for you to talk about that a bit. Yeah.
Yeah, I do think, and so a lot of people are hurting. A lot of people right now, life is hard. And I think that you can make the argument, I can make the argument really like uh like confidently that psychologically life is harder now than it ever was before. Even
Mm,
though we experienced a lot more death. Um, in previous generations and centuries and millennia of human beings. But there's, and I'm gonna return to your question, but there's
yeah.
there's a theory that I think we discussed the last time we had a chat, which is called self-determination theory, which says that human beings have three like core psychological needs, which are autonomy, competence, and uh, belonging, relatedness. Which basically what it means is, can I write my own story? Can I make that story happen? And can I fit that story in with something bigger than myself? And previously, that last one was actually pretty easy because you were part of a family, you were part of a tribe, you were part of a nation, you were part of a movement, you were part of something. And we're living in an era right now where I think the thing that most people or many people struggle with is, what does what I'm doing have anything to do with anything else? Um,
Yeah.
and so I said that whole thing because I want to say that I understand why a lot of people don't want to face any discomfort. I see why people go for the balms of, you know, well, obviously like drugs and alcohol, but also just like the social media and the
Hmm.
24-hour news cycles and these kinds of things, because it helps us plug into something bigger than ourselves.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
that said, if you can get yourself to a point where you're not suffering that much, um, there is so much to be gained by experimenting, basically. I mean, I think it's what it really comes down to is saying, I've never done that before. That doesn't sound necessarily fun, but I'm going to try it. And there's some evidence out there. There's a you know psychological metric, personality metric called openness, which is something people tend to be more open or not open. Um, I'm not going to, say what the evidence is that you can change that or not, but I would say there's a lot to be gained by just saying, hey, I hate being on the Barcelona metro, but I'm going to try it and I'm going to see like, and I think you learn a lot by doing things just a little bit differently, trying things a little bit outside your comfort zone. It sounds trite, but if you're at the place where you can do it, I think that's something that uh, really helps to foster growth.
Yeah, I love that. I've thought about this in the past. Like, so yeah, I have a master's in computer science, but my undergraduate is in theater with a
Yeah.
focus in sound design. And so I ended up doing a lot of, because it was a liberal arts degree, I ended up reading a lot of plays and learning about a lot of, plot devices and things like this. And, for a writer, there's this contrived thing. It's like sort of a cop out called Deus Ex Machina, right? It's the mechanics of the gods or the machinery of the gods, and it was basically he'd swoop in and the savior would come in. So like uh you know the orphanage is about to go get shut down, and then all of a sudden a billionaire comes in and saves the orphanage at the last minute, and everybody's happy in the end, right? Um, and while it's considered sort of a cheap trick for a writer, I think that we can cultivate Deus Ex Machina in our own lives by just putting ourselves into weird situations. And most of the time they don't pay out, right? Um, but I do think that like you have to be ready for lucky situations to happen. And this is sort of my, and maybe this is like a attitude towards openness that I have. Um, but I think that any time that I've done those like slightly off the beaten path or a little bit strange things, you know, um, sometimes a fortuitous thing will happen and people go, how did that happen? And you just, I don't know, most of the time nothing happens, right? Most of the time I hold the door open for somebody or I listen to somebody, rattle on about something and nothing comes of it. And every once in a while you're like, oh man, this was like the most interesting conversation I've had in a long time. Or, um, you know, I don't know. I think that there's something very powerful with the idea that um, if we just come to the table with what we're prepared for, we're going to miss out on so much, right? And I think maybe this gets into that self determination theory of having autonomy
Well,
in some
that's
of this
it's
too.
exactly where I was going to go because
Okay.
another thing that you and I talked about in our last conversation had to do with play.
Mm,
And I actually, now thinking about this, I kind of want to retract something I just said, which is I was saying, put yourself in uncomfortable positions, which I don't really think that's the way it works. I think the way it works is your inner child says, I'd really like to do this. And then your kind of like more grown-up self says, no, 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 don't do that. That's silly. Don't talk to that person on the airplane. Don't try making that thing. Don't put out that podcast or whatever it is. Like, you know, and actually the thing about self-determination theory, the other sort of dimension of it is that all human motivation falls on an axis of autonomy. And the least motivated you can be is if you're a slave.
Right.
That basically, like, the reason you're doing something is to avoid getting beaten. So your level of motivation is super low. And the most motivated you are is a child at play. Nobody has to dangle $5 in front of a child and say, go play. And so, in fact, I think what a lot of the facing discomfort is when you feel that urge, you're like, I want to do this thing. I want to try this new job, go back to school, whatever. And you feel this part of you get excited. And then the sort of more rational mind comes in and says, that'll never work. People will laugh at you or whatever it is. And, I don't like, it's not like I'm talking to you like, from any kind of perspective of like great success yet. But I do know that I never would have gotten to where I am today if I hadn't learned to say, hey, the stuff that I'm doing that I don't want to do just because it's making me money, I can't keep doing it. And this other thing, it might not work out. And many times they don't work out. But when you start playing in your life, your
Right.
level of motivation is just so much higher. And, I like, I'm still at the point where I'm trying new things and hoping that they work out or whatever. But my confidence that they will is so much greater than if I were doing it because somebody was handing me a contract to do it their way or whatever. So, I also want to just use this opportunity to ask you to describe, because I loved it when you talked about it. You saw yourself as a dolphin.
Oh,
You know, I'll just let you
oh,
talk.
that's so funny. Yeah, yeah. So I was doing some coaching or I was being coached, I guess, career coaching, and we were talking about you had to kind of come up with this like phrase to sum up what your ideal self is, and um, mine was that I want to be I'm the playful dolphin
Playful
that's
dolphin.
inviting you to jump in, right? And it actually reminds me a lot of there's a really like sort of new agey book from the probably the 70s or 60s called Jonathan Livingston Seagull. Have you
I
ever
don't
heard
know
of
this
this?
one. I'll add this to
Oh
the
wow.
list.
Yeah, so Richard Bachman, and it's about the seagull who um finds that just the like fighting over fish near boats and things is pretty boring, and he wanted to learn how to fly more elegantly, and he was just curious about flight. Instead of being like this awkward seagull, he was like, oh well, if he learned that if he pulled his wings in, he could dive faster and get fish that were deeper in the water, and these kind of interesting things. um and it gets into this really strange thing where these like uh seagulls from another dimension come and visit him, and he kind of goes to these other planes of existence. It's really out there, but he starts resonating on this different level, right? There's this play and he was even like kicked out of his seagull society and all these other kind of interesting things that happen. Um, and to me, one of the things that struck me was that like it was really easy to try to cling on to the side of a cliff instead of jumping and like just diving off into the water and realizing you could have so much fun, and you could struggle and resist diving into the water, or you could like, hold onto the cliff for dear life and yell at anybody else who's also might isn't acting just like you are and have a miserable existence. um and so the playful dolphin idea was this idea that like, hey, um the most rewarding things in life, like we're actually in the midst of play. I think there's in the computer science world, I have some examples of this. um Probably my patron saint of modern times is Claude Shannon. Uh, he's called the father of information theory. He actually has some like really important ideas. Like and I could go into this whole thing on him, but he, in the midst of being like this prolific thinker who changed the future of like the whole reason we're even able to like stream video right now is because of the algorithms that he figured out of like how you can send data and separate it's like noise from signal and how much signal could actually travel through. It's there's like limits in the universe, but he had this like fundamental sort of like understanding, but every bit of it was through play. Um, he actually like got into this thing called Boolean logic, which is like how all computers function, right? It's like ones or zeros. Boolean logic is true or false states. And in his book, A Mind at Play, which is the biography on Claude Shannon, he loved the word Boolean, and he would like love to say the word out loud. He would say it to his girlfriend in college, and just the playfulness of the playing with that word and him just thinking about the word more led into all of this stuff of like the mathematics. And then it went to this whole world of he'd been trained as an engineer, but he was also like a prolific mathematician. um and he combined those two worlds. It sounds alien now because engineering and mathematics are intertwined deeply, but engineering used to be considered more of a craft. You worked with clay, you actually worked with tools and did these things, and a mathematical rigor to engineering was not at the beginning of the 20th century. You used things like geometry and stuff, of course, but the idea of proving that something is engineering, like sound engineering wise, or these other pieces, or engineers who are doing electrical engineering, it was considered more of an art than a science. And he actually wrote a paper in his undergrad showing how you could like prove the correctness of like a circuit. Um, and uh, Bell Labs, which is like AT&T's research facility, used his paper to put the mathematical rigor in all of the stuff, and it saved them millions and millions of dollars. And they ended up hiring him like right after, but he was just playing around.
Yeah.
And he would do all the late into his career. He was a juggler. He built. You've probably seen these. There was a little box that if you open it, there's a little switch, and if you click the switch, a little finger pops out and turns the switch back off, and it closes itself again. It's this like absurd machine that turns itself off. He created that. Like that was just one of he just thought it was hilarious that he could have a machine that would like its only task was to disable itself. And yet he would just like, and through this play, through these all these wild things, and he just like goofed around at Bell Labs, and yet the work that would the deep thought and work that would come out was 10 lifetimes worth of other people's work, just because he was allowed to do this.
Yep.
And he took such an interesting approach. And I think when I get serious at work, or if I feel like I'm a little hard on other folks, or if I feel like I'm maybe, not bringing my best self to being a parent, it's because I've removed myself from that play, right?
Yeah.
I'm not the dolphin inviting you to jump in. I'm fixating on something else. I'm really bad with transference. So like if one other thing bothers me over here, I'll take it out over here. I'm also very susceptible to sleep, right? So if I get lose sleep, I'm a contrarian already. Like I know I take joy in that, but I will just become obstinate, stubborn, argumentative. It's like the dark side. And so, yeah, it's you also have a side of play, and I would love to flip this back around at you. You actually have a lot of interesting things where you talk about the behavior of cats.
Yes.
And so I would love, because I think that I've also had, my wife's like a cat person, and I've become a cat person. Like I actually really appreciate cats in a lot of ways. And they just seem to live in the moment in a way that's very unique. You've talked a lot about cats, and I think that it would be really cool. Is a cat to you what a dolphin is to me? I guess that's the question.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because like cats are psychopaths, right? Like, cats are just these murdering machines. But when they're in our houses, and they just very quickly turn into just the like cuddliest, uh, just loveliest little pets. I'm fascinated by cats, I think, because there is no like real genetic difference between a house cat and like an Egyptian wildcat. This is not like dogs, where we took wolves and, over generations kind of chose, like selected for certain traits. Like they just somehow figured out a way to team up with us. Um, and I find that there is something like wonderful about that. Like it makes me when I want to go to the place where I'm like, there's maybe something else going on in this universe that I'm not aware of. Like that just seems like one of these forces that I can't explain. How cats just kind of like, you know, found a way to like get a little bit closer to humans, get access to the mice and rats that would be around our grain. The Egyptians started worshiping them. I don't know. There's a story, if it's apocryphal or not, that the way the Persians beat the Egyptians in a battle is that the Persians attacked the Egyptians and every Persian soldier held a cat, and the Egyptians wouldn't like fight the Persians if it meant that they might hurt a cat. So
Whoa. Even if that's apocryphal, I think it's an amazing story.
yeah,
That's
and
hilarious.
and so I think that there's, and then I don't know if you're aware of this parasite called um
Is it
toxoplasmosis.
toxoplasmosis? Yeah.
And toxoplasmosis is a parasite that likes to live in the stomach of cats. And so, like, it'll get in mice and rats, and the cats will eat them, and it goes in there. And then we humans can get it from cats. And it's actually, for pregnant women, quite dangerous if they contract toxoplasmosis while they're pregnant. But aside from that, what researchers have found is that uh, there are small but statistically significant differences between human beings who are toxoplasmosis positive and human beings who are toxoplasmosis negative. And some of these differences include you're more likely to, you take more risks. You're more likely to get in a car accident if you're toxoplasmosis positive. I think women find toxoplasmosis positive men more attractive than toxoplasmosis negative men. And really the
Interesting.
association with this is like cat people, because it makes you like cats more. So this is my like kind of cosmic conspiracy theory, I guess, is what I'm saying, is that there's the cats have something that they're up to, that we aren't aware of. That they have some, the cat collective wisdom is something that we should be paying attention to.
Interesting. Yeah, I've really come to appreciate cats. And I think that there's something beautiful to they're both, it's both brutal and in the moment, right? That there's something about like I might be worried about paying a bill or my annual review at work or something, and my cat is literally just like, I'm gonna attack this catnip mouse over here, right? Or like I'm gonna like pat at you if you go down the stairs a certain way. And there's a playfulness to it as well, especially with house cats. I mean, even if you watch animal documentaries,
Yep.
some David Attenborough thing, and you'll see the two lions, acting the same way. Um, that's really fascinating. Yeah, and there's a wildness. It's funny too because like I grew up with dogs, and I appreciate dogs, and dogs are like a very unique form of companionship. I think in a lot of ways, like younger humans, there's a little bit of intelligence overlap of this wanting to reciprocate, wanting to be loyal, and I do understand why people really appreciate those. Um, but I've also really come to appreciate what cats do, which is like sort of, to me, a cat kind of just tolerates you, as like it's you, it's not trying to win your approval all the time like a dog does. It's really more like it's allowed you into its world to cohabitate. And I don't know, there's like a confidence to that. And also like I like that the cat is just sort of very autonomous, right? We enjoy each other's presence. but we don't have this like codependent
Yep.
relationship like I have with a dog, right? With a dog, you get really emotionally attached, or have to deal with certain things, and that's interesting. I want to explore more of the toxoplasmosis thing. Well, this is interesting because like, and again, this gets us back to COVID. Um, you know, there's a lot of fear around viruses and infections and being unclean and doing all of these other things. But if you actually look back to human life, we have like a tremendous amount of our DNA that's actually like virus fragments and of all creatures. And we're getting into these like what I would think of as like orthogonal relationships, right? It's really easy to look at this sort of materialist view of like, oh, there's this order to evolution, and you are the parents that all generations behind you, cumulative. But we've learned about things like epigenetics, right, where behaviors or environmental exposures can actually like change the behavior of DNA. But we also see things like viruses or parasites that actually can influence us as well. Um, I wonder. This gets us back to the humanity bath thing. I wonder if the exposure to these things, as brutal as they can be sometimes, right? And I'm not trying to like romanticize COVID or anything like this, but that like viruses and toxoplasmosis and all of these like sort of things actually play a much deeper part of life um, than we realize. That this exposure and these accidental recombinations is actually like a form of life that if we didn't have this, where what trajectory could we, if we killed all viruses today, for instance, would we thrive, or would something horrible and accidental happen in which life stagnates in a way? Um, and I've been I don't know, it's just like an out there idea, but have you thought about this, or is this a model of like life that you've thought about? I know the toxoplasmosis, but have you thought about the relationship between viruses being some sort of ancient thing that might actually be important?
So yeah, I mean, I haven't thought about it specifically that way. Um, but there is this idea that like the so we talked earlier about like national narcissism. Um,
Mm,
I think maybe like even the bigger challenge we have is just like kind of a species narcissism, that
mm,
we really see ourselves as separate from the rest of the world. And what I feel like what you're getting at is, we are part of nature. We are nature.
right.
And um, there is this, uh, and I don't know if this comes from, if this is sort of a modernist thing or what, that we really want to sort of scrub our like this dirt and just be able to live in our glass towers, um, clean of any kind of smell or anything that actually is like is human. Um, and I think that's something we need to be really careful about. Um, there's a so I think I may have mentioned to you like how I found out about Metamodernism in the first place.
Yeah, please, let's
Wh-
talk about it. I don't remember
which
actually.
is I so I worked in management consulting. I got an MBA. I spent some time in VC, and then I was working at tech companies here in Paris. And my whole like dream was to get on a rocket ship, and I did it. I got on a company that like was growing like crazy and became a unicorn. And my experience was that actually I got really bored. That I was like the dog who caught the mail truck or whatever. And I was like, this is not what it was interesting. So I wound up going back to school to get a master's in organizational psychology. And um, if you want to compare the 2 degrees, the MBA is a very modernist degree. The master's in organizational psychology is a postmodern degree. It's a lot of criticism. It's a lot of tearing down the old ways of thinking about things, which at the time I really needed. I needed the tools to tear apart this world that I just was not believing in anymore. And I got through the degree and I started doing some work and I realized it feels like there's an update to everything I learned that if you put it together is saying something around, how the basic building block of humanity is not individuals, it's the relationships in between the individuals.
Ooh, yeah, that's
And
interesting.
I thought, this is something I feel like it's not a super novel idea, but I haven't seen it sort of really crystallized anywhere. So I had this idea of writing a book, and I think I published on my Substack 2.5 chapters of this book I was beginning. And then I saw on Twitter the table of contents to Hansi Freinacht's self-help book, The 12 Commandments. And I think the very first chapter title there is called Live in a Mess, which is kind of posed as a contrast to Jordan Peterson's clean your room or whatever his rule is.
Oh, I love that.
And the point that they make in this chapter is that actually there's this desire to be pure and clean. And this is going back to your previous question about purity tests, is a
Yeah,
really,
interesting.
really dangerous one. This is, purity is something we should be very, very careful about. There are certain things I do want pure. I don't know, my drinking water or whatever. But there when we start believing too much in purity, we lose. Well, we tend to do awful things to each other.
Yeah,
We also lose touch with the fact that we are impure. There's this a great replacement theory that we're bringing people and we're making our gene pools impure. And like you
right,
said, our gene pools are full of dead viruses.
right.
There's
Yeah,
there's
for sure.
nothing pure about them to begin with. Um, and yeah, and I know just to return to the metamodern stuff, that just kind of sent me down a path where I realized that metamodernism isn't it's not like an ideology the way communism is, or you could argue
Right,
wokeism or Trumpism. It's
right,
it's more an emerging way of looking at the world that once you get there, you can have these conversations with people who believe things very differently from you. You don't find all metamodernists wind up agreeing that immigration is good and free Palestine or whatever. You get
hmm,
lots of different viewpoints, but the ways that people communicate on them allow for real learning. And you move away from this debate culture, which
right.
kind of never convinces anyone of anything, and you move towards a real learning culture. And I've just found in my personal relationships that means a lot. I like being around people who um, uh, are really good at listening and really good at communicating and recognizing their own biases or allergies or whatever, but being willing to share their principles and try to understand situations from different points of view. That's been for me, learning about this and sort of moving into these meta-modern spaces and just connecting with people who don't even I think when we met, you wouldn't have characterized yourself as meta-modern, but I think my thesis right now is that there are a lot of people out there who are thinking this way or beginning to think this way.
Mm-hmm.
And, you talk about being the playful dolphin, inviting people to come play. And I think I want to be like the uh, welcoming cat, right? Who says, welcome to this way of looking at things. Come here and feel free to bring your messy human self, um,
Yeah.
uh, because we don't expect anything different of you. Um, and uh, I that's that for me feels like a calling that I can kind of like follow at least for a while now.
I can see that. The years ago I took this like soul of entrepreneurship workshop, and the woman running it mentioned looking for when people light up.
Mm,
Like when they light up, that is a deep sort of authenticity. And it's cool to watch you light up when you talk about
yeah.
this. Um, it made me think about, are you familiar with Adlerian psychology or Adlerian theory?
I don't know if I know
Alfred
this.
Adler. Oh, so I think it's, again, this will be something that I share with you that I think you'll get a kick out of. Um, Alfred Adler was a contemporary of Sigmund Freud,
Mm,
but had a very different sort of form of psychoanalysis. And it was referred to as individual psychology. And he stressed the importance of like how an individual is influenced by their social context. And he actually says all problems are interpersonal problems. And it made me think of this when you were talking about this relationship dynamic. And it actually ties all the way back into metamodernism to me, in that, like, I think when we first talked, I said something to the effect of, um, I've really become an anti-utopian. And I mean this in like a philosophical sense, not to say that we can't make the world a better place, but that anyone who promises a future, a utopia, but wants power now is
mm,
suspicious to me,
yeah,
right? Um,
absolutely.
and and this is religion. This is also religion of course says, oh, you'll get these riches in heaven, but you have to do this stuff right now, and give me money every month and do all these other things. Um, there's very much is embedded into secular society as well, um, where they say, okay, well, one day after all this struggle, things will be better. And I've really become very suspicious of this, because I feel like, and I don't want to use the term incrementalism, but I do mean in the sense that, like, the idea that you brought up earlier about being able to dance, right? Being able to participate. If we can't participate in something that's like markedly better now, and demonstrably better now, I'm very suspicious that we're actually on the right track, right? Um, and so, yeah, I this will be some homework for you. I would love to actually hear about things you do or don't like about Adlerian psychology, because obviously some of it's probably dated at this point, but some of it I think are deep insights and probably influence things like metamodernism, to be honest.
Yeah, and just obviously I can't comment on an Adler, but what you say that does really resonate is that growth is hard.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the thing, even like therapy, for example, even like, you know, and I do encourage people to go to therapy, because I do think that a lot of us have things. Some people really hesitate to use the word trauma, but we have things that we might not say like reach the level of trauma, but from our youth that we have we didn't have the capacity back then to sort of really talk through, and I think that can be beneficial for a lot of people. But when you grow, you change, and when you change, you lose things, and when you lose things, you grieve, and this is part of life. Like, this is, life is a lot of loss. And you talk about a utopia. There is no utopia. When we grow, we're going to experience pain, and the getting the ratio right between how much growth and how much healing, I think is a really good question to put out there, because we're talking right now with people who call themselves like accelerationists.
Yes. Oh
And
gosh, that's such a weird world of.
and like I get where you're coming from, but at the same time, we're human beings, and
Right.
already we see the effects of rapid change on our well-being. And I really, if there's like one thing that I'd like for people to keep in mind, it's like hold some space for those grieving people. Hold some space for the people who haven't figured it out yet. I have a little story that I should probably write up one of these days, which is when I was in middle school. People can try to guess what age I was, uh, or which age I am now. When I was in middle school, um, there was a style that went around where they call it French cuffing. You used to take the bottom of your jeans, you'd fold them, and you'd roll them up twice. And so everyone did this with their jeans. And, I did it every day for who knows, like probably a year and a half, 2 years or something. And one day I was in shop class, like woodworking class. And we're sitting on those, like, stools at the big work desk, the workbench. And this girl, Jamie, uh, like gets my attention from a few seats down. And she goes, Robert, nobody's rolling up their jeans anymore. And I look down and I realize I am the last person in the school. And since I'm going to school in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, possibly the last person in the country who's still rolling up their jeans. And um, the I think that so much of what we consider to be like ethics or morals is actually aesthetics. And a lot of people just haven't caught up yet to the fact that we are, like we're listening more these days. We're
Yeah.
extending people the benefit of the doubt. They haven't gotten that message yet. They're still rolling up their jeans. And I try to hold a lot of compassion for them too, because I don't think that they're bad people. And I think that in a lot of ways they haven't gotten the message yet. They haven't that fashion hasn't come to them yet. Um, so yeah, but they might do some bad things until they figure it out.
Yeah. No, and I think that's a really interesting piece to this is that it takes a lot. I think it takes a lot of courage to reach the conclusion that you don't know, or that you shouldn't weigh in, or that you shouldn't necessarily force someone to behave one way or the other. Um, to me, this is like where the best parts of scientific thinking come from, which is starting from the position of I don't
Yeah,
know, right? I think the most dangerous side is, and I think there's a term that's used kind of divisively, but it's called scientism,
yeah,
right? Which is sort of the religion of
yeah,
science, which I think is actually really harmful. And that's the sort of like begging for authority sort of thing, like, oh, well, 10,000 of us say this is true, so it's true. And you're like, well, no, like it might be that you are educated on this topic and you're enlightened and I'm not. And so maybe I should pay attention and understand. But if you can't explain it to me, I think the burden still falls on you, right? Like you don't get to just win because you said 10,000 of you say something. Um, and I think that this is I don't know, there's something to this where being this listener, and it doesn't mean tolerating horrible, immoral things, right? But it does mean that you don't have to weigh in immediately. You can actually just listen, hear people out, and then go, you know what? Actually, no, that's like Nazi stuff. I'm not cool with that.
yeah.
Like we're not doing it. But can somebody have a Nazi opinion who's not in a position of power? And you go, oh man, how did you reach that conclusion? Like, what path did you take in which you looked at all the data that I looked at as well? And I thought, yeah, that's the That's what we're missing here, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And,
Yeah.
and it's, I wince when you said that, because I could almost hear the people saying, are you saying that we should make room for Nazis? It's like, kind of,
Yeah. Well,
like, yes, like,
yeah.
um, we need to understand other people, and the old way of just shaming people out of society, it's just not working anymore. And
I,
so, yeah,
Chomsky brings this up quite well, right? Again, this gets back to like Noam Chomsky's thoughts on this, which of course, his argument was if you force someone to cover up the boils on your skin, it doesn't make the deeper problem go
yeah,
away, right? It actually makes things worse
yeah,
because now you have an untreated set of boils that are just going to spread until one day it either kills the host or causes it to spread or do these other horrible things. And instead, we should have a very uncomfortable conversation on why are there boils there in the first place, right? And that's why, like someone like Chomsky, and I know that again, it's the right wing has taken this thing of they use the term free speech maximalism, and they don't actually mean it. But I, in the traditional, uh, sort of like left, anarchist left way of looking at free speech maximalism, I see it as a survival technique in a way for us to question power, right? It's the powerful that exploit the lack of free speech. It's the powerless that need the freedom to actually say sometimes horrible things, sometimes incredibly wrong things. Um, and we shouldn't be so scared of someone saying something wrong or even convincing somebody else of something wrong. If we really are on the right side of history long term, we'll win long term. Like even if in the short term, really rightfully outraged, if you played Mad Libs and you swapped out the party titles and they used the same tactics, would you agree or disagree? Right. And I think that there are some folks on the left that if they used the sort of authoritarian tactics that some of the right wingers are using right now, they would actually cheerlead it.
I'm sure.
Um,
Yeah, I'm
and
sure.
that's the scary thing to me. It's not that one party's winning or not. It's that are we on a path in which do we have autonomy? Can we actually make the world a better place and be empowered from the bottom up? Or um, is the top going to pick a new boogeyman and then blame all problems on it and then skirt due process and skirt all of these other things like we're seeing right now,
Yeah,
right? Like we're seeing this with the no due process for, um, and I think to get into again the politics here, and I think that your insights would be interesting. Um, Bernie Sanders just got in a bunch of trouble for saying he was asked what kind of couple of things that Trump was doing that were good, and he actually was like, "Hey, we need to pay attention to immigration. Um, we can't just have open, porous borders." And of course, he gets like destroyed. Of course, this is incredibly consistent Bernie Sanders view. And then, of course, he goes on to say, "But the way that we're skirting due process and trying to categorize people as terrorists and not having any way of is completely wrong." Right? That part didn't make the soundbite. The other one was, "Oh, Bernie's a secret fascist
yeah,
or Bernie's a
right.
secret Nazi." And this is the part that scares me because I'm just like, we've gone cuckoo.
Yeah, yeah. No, and it goes back to like the purity tests you were talking about.
Yeah.
It's this idea that there are these the rating systems out there for candidates where, like, are you on the right side of these issues? And
Right.
I I always remember like growing up and people were like, well, I'm an issues voter. And I think about that and I'm like, I'm not an issues voter. I'm like a how complex a thinker are you voter? And the people who start by saying, you know, uh, no restrictions on immigration, I feel like you're just saying from the beginning that you're not willing to have a conversation and accept some people's, just because you oppose or you want a reduction in immigration doesn't mean you're a racist. Like,
Right.
doesn't. There are plenty
Right.
of good reasons to want to restrict immigration. But I think that what's been really frustrating for me is there doesn't seem to be any space in the public sphere for a conversation that is aesthetically pleasing to someone who considers themselves a metamodernist. You know,
Right. Oh, absolutely.
and you know, I would love to have like some space where a metamodern person on the right, a person on the left, a metamodern person, you know, anarcho-capitalists, whatever, can get together and acknowledge, you know, that these are valid issues and it's not easy. Like these, the whole reason these are, what's the term? Not nasty problems. Um, but anyway, there's a guy who's coined a phrase for like really thorny problems. Um,
Mm,
the reason that these problems are so thorny is that they're not easily solved. And
right.
I think what we're seeing and kind of what I expect to see in the next, you know, however many years is there are going to be a lot of simple solutions applied to these problems, and the problems aren't going to get better, or other problems are going to emerge. And
Yeah.
I hope that collectively, as a country and as a world, we can learn that, oh yeah, we've tried this old way of, you know, linear problem solving, scapegoating, all of these approaches, and actually things aren't getting better. I hope we can do that before things get too bad. And, you know, I can't say I'm like super optimistic, but I'm going to continue to like proceed every day as if that's still a possibility.
Yeah. That I think that's a really I think that's a really interesting way of looking at this too, which is that, you know, I'm always trying to balance the the there's a book I haven't read yet, but I want to. But I've read a little bit about it. It's called Entertaining Ourselves to Death.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about this. I think it was actually written back in the '80s, talking about the rise of television, which I think though we've exacerbated the problem much worse. And I notice this about myself. Like when I'm more stressed out, I'll watch more. You go down YouTube rabbit holes, right? Where I'm like, I was just watching something about like an indigenous population on Japan, and I had never heard about it, and I was like, oh man. And then I'm like, wait a minute, why am I like, do I need to be doing this? Or like, I'm glad that I know about this, but did I really need to just like watch, you know, 3 videos on it? Um, and I think it's very easy. I think getting back to like what you talked about earlier of like, on one level, we're the wealthiest as civilization we've ever been. We have all these opportunities and things, but I think psychologically, we probably do live in one of the most difficult times, um, just because of how overwhelming things can feel. And it's really easy for things to get overwhelming really fast, right? And I worry about the fact that like what can we control and how can we structure our lives in which we can bring our best selves? Because I'm maybe that's the hopeless optimist in me. I think if we spend more time just living our best selves, not necessarily being hugely impactful in society like a celebrity, but just being our best selves cumulatively, we will make a better society, right? That's sort of, and I think that sort of meets the metamodernist ethos as well. I think that right now we have a society that rewards miserable people being in charge,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And this is what you look at. Like this is my when I look at Elon Musk, this is my thoughts on him. I actually feel really bad for the guy.
Yep.
I don't excuse the ridiculous behavior or some of the really harmful things that he's doing, but I look at it and go, how could you be that wealthy and that miserable
Yep.
and not be able to like just be? Like, why do you have to get all up in everything all the time?
Yep.
Like, what's there's like a deep dissatisfaction. And I think that, you know, US style capitalism, for instance, deeply rewards this, right? Somebody who's like, oh man, you know, taxis suck. I'm going to make an app that makes it really easy to get a taxi. And we reward them. They become billionaires, right? But like, did we need to solve that problem? Like, was it really that revolutionary? Or, you know, and I don't want to like nitpick because I think there's lots of little innovations that I don't understand that are fine. But, you know, there's no feedback loop that I can see that rewards maximal, like, can we make the cat version of a government
Yeah.
in which like we kind of let it just chill and do its thing? It's like play some important roles, like helps us existentially stop bad things from happening. But like we really don't want to micromanage it. We really would just like it to kind of like be this thing that's like in the room with us and lets us know that it's like kind of happy, and then let me do my own thing too. And um, you know, we have a peaceful. We're not in the wartime stuff all the time. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
So what I would say to that is like, it is that living your best life, being,
mhm.
a shining example to other people of, because I think people, there's kind of like the envy that people have, like, of wealth, clearly, where they're like, I want to be more like that person who has a lot of stuff. Um, and that has something, I think, to do with the fact that, well, we're great apes, and we like shiny things, and but I also think people recognize who seems happy and
Right.
who seems fulfilled and who
Right.
seems like they're learning and growing. And what I think, beyond just like living that best life, that we have to do is we have to start like actively cultivating those connections. So
Yeah.
it's like what we're doing on this podcast right now. But it's also, anyone who listens to this, like, connect, like, reach out to each other, and in your like real world communities, even if you don't live among like dozens of people who think the way that you do, you can still connect with them on a human level. And
Yeah.
it's harder to do that fighting that's happening right now, when you can humanize the people who are being painted as boogeymen on MSNBC or Fox
Yeah.
News. When you're like,
Yep.
oh no, actually, uh, you know, all cops are what? Like, I have family members who are cops. I have friends who are
Right.
cops. I have
Right.
friends who are, you know, uh, illegal immigrants without papers. Like, that happens. And it doesn't mean you don't. So I really think that our sort of duty, in a way, is to play that role of, you know, connecting people a little bit more, and trying to restore a little bit of that social glue that we've lost. Um, and it's fun. I mean, I think the other thing, like, I think that you would say too, is it's fun to like discover more about people, meet people. You
Yeah.
don't have to be a super extrovert
No.
to do this every
Yeah.
now and then.
Yep. Um, to close things out, I would love to hear what you have on your plate. What are you focused on? I know that you've talked about, your rise through the sort of corporate environment and shifting gears. And what are you excited about? What have you got on the horizon?
Yeah, actually, so back in November, I, as a birthday present to myself, took a course with one of the authors behind Hansi Freinacht. Um, and it was amazing. It was like, I think I may have written about this in the Substack. I had this idea that I wanted to sort of run by them, which was sort of like an ultra simplified version of these like stages of both human and cultural development. Um, and I came up with like 7 words to describe them. So it's like the body, which is, and that's simplified because that's very complex, but that's both like human beings, like, the first human beings, 400,000 years ago, equated with like a baby. And then you have the child, which is like 70,000 years ago. You have, what do you call it? Animism. So the words, anyway, I'll just go: body, wonder, power, oneness, reason, criticism, and integration. I think you used another word that I'm not remembering right now, but it's bringing it all together.
Oh, It was it reconciliation?
Reconciliation maybe
Mm-hmm.
was the word. And I then one of the so in one of the courses he mentioned that they were looking at starting a metamodern consulting firm. Um, the idea being that they had been focused on politics for a long time, and they've recognized that politics actually lags entrepreneurship in terms of picking up on new ideas. So
Mm-hmm.
the pattern goes, it starts with art, then philosophy, then entrepreneurship, then politics, then ethics. Um, so what they've kind of realized was politics isn't ready for metamodernism just yet. But the entrepreneurial world is starting to do these things on their own. And when you look at like the Web3 area, you see a lot of idealistic self-organizing communities.
Mm-hmm.
Some are thriving, some are struggling, but it's like this is the cutting edge of of business right now. And so I wrote to them and said, uh, "Hey, I think if you want to communicate with the business public, you need to really make it simple." So I presented them like my 7 words, and they came back and said, "This is really interesting. Let's talk." And so we've been talking over the past few months, and we actually are just putting the finishing touches on. And it's actually only going to be, I'm going to be working with Daniel Gertz, but we're calling ourselves Metamoderna Culture Labs. Um, and
Cool.
we're releasing a white paper very shortly. And the idea is to help this sort of emerging generation of leaders who recognize that the old ways of, doing things top down weren't working, but also that just trying to like foster a decentralized movement doesn't work either. And you need to
Mm-hmm.
blend both the sort of modern and postmodern ways of leadership in order to create this new world. And, we don't, like you said, we don't have a vision of what utopia looks like, but I'm pretty sure that the way that we get there is going to be by fostering this new approach to leadership and organizations and organizational culture. Um, and yeah, just really excited to sort of bring this into the world. Um, and it's a dream come true for me because these guys, like, they're like my intellectual heroes, but they're really really nice, sweet guys. And we hope to build out a team and kind of see where this goes.
That's so cool. How should people look up your writings or your posts online or things like that? How do people get a hold of you?
Yeah. So I mean, you can find me professionally. I go by Robert Kelley Ayala because there's so many Robert Kellys out there. Robert Kelley with an EYAYALA. You can find me on LinkedIn, Substack. My newsletter is called Meowchiavelli, just like a ruthless cat uh, strategist, and yeah, obviously happy to talk to anyone who finds this interesting, and always happy to talk to you too, Nate.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'll put links to everything in the show notes. And this has been an amazing conversation. I really appreciate you talking to me.
Thanks so much. We'll see you around.
See ya.
See ya.